Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. So I am going to be doing a talk based on a paper that I published for a special Frontiers edition of dedicated to psychedelic humanities that a few of us wrote. I think Peter also wrote, well, I know Peter wrote a paper for it as well. And my paper was called More Evolved Than You, and it's about evolutionary spirituality as a frame for psychedelic experience. This came out of a project that I worked on during the pandemic. I was working on a book about Aldous Huxley and his friends and family, and I was just curious to discover Aldous's support for eugenics, both from the 20s all the way to the end of his career, and this got me looking at evolutionary spirituality and its tendency towards what I call kind of spiritual eugenics. So I did some research on that, and I've been working on a book on it, but most of my time is now taken up with this challenging psychedelic experiences project. But I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my research, and at the end, I'll come back to how this kind of connects to the work that Irini and I and others are doing on challenging psychedelic experiences. Okay. So the key points that I'm going to cover over the next hour are, I think I hope to persuade you, maybe you already think this, that it's useful and interesting to learn about evolutionary spirituality and its role in the history of New Age culture and psychedelic culture. And I think it's been understudied so far. And it's still very much present in psychedelic culture, this frame of evolutionary spirituality. Rick Doblin of MAPS, for example, says that he hopes psychedelics will lead to a core of evolved humanity. Roland Griffiths also argued that psychedelics can help in the evolution of humanity. Christian Angermayer, the leading investor in psychedelics, has argued that humans will eventually split into two different species, immortal cosmic superbeings and the uninvolved who choose to stay behind on Earth. So we're going to look at some of the history and tenets of evolutionary spirituality. And I'm going to point out 4 flaws that I think proponents of evolutionary spirituality often fall into. Spiritual narcissism, contempt for the unevolved masses, social Darwinism and Malthusianism, and a tendency to illiberal and authoritarian spiritual eugenics. I don't say that everyone who believes in evolutionary spirituality falls into these moral traps. And I'll at the end, I'll talk about, some well-known figures who don't. I'm going to move quite quickly. This is quite kind of, they're covering a lot of history of ideas here. If you want to look for, some of the supporting evidence, it's in my Frontiers paper and in a lot of articles that I've published online on these topics. So firstly, how do we define evolutionary spirituality? It's a subset of the broader New Age movement. Not everyone in New Age culture believes in evolutionary spirituality, but some do. It's based on the idea that human evolution is not finished and can be guided towards the creation of higher beings through such techniques as meditation, psychedelics, and genetic modification. It's a kind of religion, a worship of human potential and our potential to evolve into super beings, or at least the potential of some humans to evolve into super beings. So I'm going to paint a brief prehistory of evolutionary spirituality. You can trace it as far back as you like, but you could say that one of its origins is in Renaissance Neoplatonic magic and the idea that special advanced superior beings have the potential to evolve into gods. There also, you could see historical roots in 18th century moral progressivism in the theories of people like Scottish Enlightenment philosophers like Adam Smith or Adam Ferguson, or David Hume, this idea that human society evolves through certain stages, from peasant to agricultural to capitalist, and this is a natural evolution into morally superior societies. Likewise, at the end of the 18th century, you have utopian thinkers like Godwin and the Marquis de Condorcet, arguing that eventually science will progress so far that humans will become these blissful, immortal beings. I think Malthus is also a key figure in the history of evolutionary spirituality. Malthus was suspicious of the utopianism of Godwin, of course, but he also argued that, in his words, the world is a mighty process for the creation and formation of mind, so that there's this kind of natural evolution that's guided by the supreme mind, in which more conscious and more moral forms replicate, while less conscious and less moral forms die off. So there's a kind of a progress, natural progress towards higher and more conscious and more moral forms in Malthus's universe. Likewise, in some German romantic and idealist thinkers of the 19th century, or the late 18th, early 19th century, you have this idea of God or spirit or Geist evolving through nature and through human history, what Emerson called the progressive God. Now, all these theories suggest that nature is an arc tending towards higher moral forms, or nature is a kind of ladder or escalator going towards higher moral forms. Of course, Darwinism in the middle of the 19th century was a challenge to these ideas of natural moral progress. In the Darwinian universe, there is no higher or better in nature. There's no ladder inevitably going towards higher forms. Instead, nature's more like a branching tree going in all kinds of different directions. And you can't call any of those directions higher or better. They're just more fit to particular circumstances. So this is a challenge to the idea of a moral cosmos that naturally evolves towards higher forms or better forms. Nonetheless, the triumph of Darwinism in the middle of the 19th century inspired countless more progressivist and spiritual versions of evolution to arise. Substitute religions, which try to find new sources of meaning, myth, ethics, and purpose in an evolutionary universe. And the philosopher Mary Midgley and many others have written about this kind of idea of evolutionary religions. These science religions appeal to the authority of evolution, much as previous religions appeal to the authority of God. God in evolution sometimes become somewhat interchangeable terms. What would be some examples of evolutionary spiritualities before World War II? You could talk about Herbert Spencer's Religion of the Unknowable, Nietzsche's Cult of the Übermensch. Of course, this, Nietzsche, as Peter will tell us, was not really a champion of anything like organized religion, but nonetheless, many of his followers took up this idea of the coming Übermensch and turned it into a kind of evolutionary cult. Ernst Haeckel's monism, Henri Bergson's ideas of creative evolution. Several figures in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn believe in this idea that they are steering evolution towards the creation of super beings. Likewise, Theosophy and Anthroposophy have this idea of spiritual evolution leading towards higher forms of humans, higher root races. Sri Aurobindo's Integral Yoga also has this idea that evolution can be steered towards the creation of higher spiritual beings. You find a similar idea in Teilhard de Chardin's Evolutionary Christian Mysticism, and in Julian Huxley's Evolutionary Humanism, which he later called transhumanism. likewise in Buck's Cosmic Consciousness, which some of you might have read, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And how about after World War II? You also still find these kind of evolutionary spiritualities thriving, like the human potential movement of Aldous Huxley, Abraham Maslow, Michael Murphy, one of the founders of Esalen, that's him in a photo with Huxley, and many others like Osho, for example, who are part of that human potential movement. The transpersonal psychology of Stan Grof is also something of an evolutionary spirituality, this idea that humans have the potential to evolve to a higher stage of consciousness at a species level. Ken Wilber's integral theory is another example of a post-war evolutionary spirituality. You get 80s spiritual influences like Barbara Marx Hubbard and Andrew Cohen, who champion forms of evolutionary spirituality. There's actually a group called the Evolutionary Leaders, which includes figures like Hubbard before she died and Deepak Chopra, and that's still active. And then you get modern transhumanists and proponents of what Emile, I think Torre, I'm pronouncing it correctly, is he calls Teskreal. I don't know if some of you might have seen Nisha Devano's recent paper on this, but Teskreal is the kind of different philosophies that are popular in Silicon Valley at the moment, like transhumanism, extropianism, singularitarianism, cosmon and rationalism, all of which have this idea that humans can evolve into superhumans or can invent new technologies, superintelligences. These varieties of evolutionary spirituality share two central ideas. First, that it's possible and desirable to combine science and spirituality or religion into a new synthesis, a kind of empirical spirituality. And this, it is believed, could eventually replace Christianity and other traditional religions and become a global religion of the future. And secondly, this idea that human evolution is an ongoing process which can be guided to higher and better forms. Apostles of evolutionary spirituality think humans have the potential to evolve into super beings called things like the new man, the Ubermensch, Homo Deus, the coming race, the future human, the transhuman, the self-actualized person, or perhaps a collective stage of consciousness, such as the new sphere, superintelligence, the supermind, or the singularity. Believers in evolutionary spirituality typically have a Lamarckian view of evolution. Lamarck, before Darwin, thought that humans can develop physical, mental, or spiritual characteristics and then pass them on to future descendants. So it's this idea of inherited characteristics. The famous example is that a blacksmith might develop big muscles in their work, and then their children will inherit those big muscles. Now, in evolutionary spirituality, it's more common to have this idea that you can attain a new state of consciousness, a higher state of consciousness, and that this will then mark an evolution, not just for you as an individual, but for your species. You'll be the kind of first bud of a new higher species. And you can attain that through like yoga or meditation or psychedelics. So one example of this is Cosmic Consciousness, a book by the Canadian psychiatrist Richard Morris Buck, which came out in, I think, 1901 or 1900. Buck believed that certain special humans, particularly him and his friends, were attaining this new higher state of consciousness, this experiences of cosmic consciousness. And these weren't just random spiritual experiences. This was actually a kind of evolutionary unfolding of a new species, a higher species. And that this new species, these kind of peak experiences would become more and more common. And they were superior to Homo sapiens, he thought, as we are to dogs. And that eventually this new spiritually enlightened race will dominate the earth and the old species will die off. So there's a fusion of kind of Darwinian or some kind of evolutionary theory with spirituality and this idea of a new species emerging. And it's often suggested in evolutionary spirituality that spiritual techniques like yoga, meditation, and psychedelics can speed up evolution for a few special people and through them for the entire species. And this is an idea that's been put forward by everyone from Albert Hoffman to Aldous and Julian Huxley, to Humphrey Osmond, Timothy Leary, Ralph Metzner, Robert Anton Wilson, Terence McKenna, Stan Groff, Rick Doblin, and other leading psychedelic thinkers. So it's a very common idea that psychedelics can advance human evolution. Now, I'm now going to point out 4 moral traps in evolutionary spirituality, but it's worth saying that there are things to celebrate in this spiritual tradition. The synthesis of science and spirituality, the attempt to kind of develop an empirical spirituality, which has been an effort ever since William James to rather than for science to ignore things like spiritual experiences, to integrate them, to study them. And that's, I think, what, an effort that many of us are involved in. Likewise, evolutionary spirituality has an optimistic vision of human potential, of our capacity to rise up and to be, live longer, to be happier, to be better beings. However, I do see certain kind of pitfalls in this tradition as well, which I highlight to try and help people in this tradition perhaps avoid them. For example, I'm gonna highlight 4. The first is spiritual narcissism. Now, most religions can lead to a certain smugness or narcissism in those who see themselves as the elect, as the pure, as the chosen ones. But I think that evolutionary spirituality could be particularly prone to narcissism, or at least its own particular variant of it, because its followers think they're not just morally better because they pray in the right way or eat in the right way or that kind of thing. They also think they're biologically superior and possibly even a whole different species. And another reason they can be prone to narcissism is that there's a rejection of humility. This is that you see it in Nietzsche and many of his descendants, that humility is for the weak, humility is hypocritical, that you should be proud of your superiority. There's this idea that we are the gods. There's no God beyond us. We are the gods. So there's a worship of the future human, but often that involves a worship for oneself. Invariably, proponents of evolutionary spirituality think that there's a hierarchy in nature, that some humans are more evolved, and they almost invariably think that includes them. So they and their friends are in this kind of 5% at the top of the hierarchy of nature. So, for example, here's a quote from Ken Wilber's online course, Superhuman. He says, a small percentage of the human population, around 5%, is now undergoing a quantum leap to this emerging stage of evolution. These rare individuals from every corner of the globe are now blazing a new evolutionary trail for all of us and breaking through to new levels of consciousness and capabilities beyond anything that humans have ever experienced before. And I've interviewed kind of, ex followers of Wilber, people like Jamie Wheel, who talk about how often in integral theory, there can be a tendency to feeling quite puffed up, like we are this top 5%, we are the special ones, and everyone else is just more basic. Or here's another example. This is a speech by Abraham Maslow that he made to some Silicon Valley executives. He says, it has been suggested that only about 5% of the general population are active agents his idea of these kind of self-actualized individuals. They are the ones who run themselves and the world. It is very clear to me that every single member of this group are one of those active agents. So there he is flattering his corporate audience. And here's James Orrock, another psychedelic writer. He wrote in one of his books, "We are the sharpened spearhead of humanity. We are the ones who have had what the psychologist Abraham Maslow described as the absolute peak experience, the ultimate achievement of being human, something that only occurs for a tiny fraction of the human population. We are the 5% who have to help humanity move into its next phase, the recognition of our own divine origins." So I think there's this tendency to narcissism, to seeing yourself as the biologically superior elect. Secondly, this can be accompanied with a contempt for those you see at the bottom of the spiritual, natural, spiritual, biological hierarchy, for those, for the unfit or less evolved masses. Again, you could put some of this at Nietzsche's door. He saw nature as hierarchical, and those at the bottom of the hierarchy are a waste of space, the pitiful masses. I don't know if any of you have read John Kerry's excellent book, The Intellectual and the Masses, but it's a brilliant kind of analysis of in modernist culture, of how many modernist intellectuals had, took from Nietzsche or developed for themselves this kind of contempt for the masses. You see it from D.H. Lawrence or in Aldous Huxley or in Virginia Woolf. So, for example, Aldous Huxley wrote, about 99.5% of the entire population of the planet are as stupid and as Philistine as the great masses of the English. The important thing, it seems to me, is not to attack the 99.5%, except for exercise, but to try to see that the 0.5% survives, keeps its quality up to the highest possible level, and if possible, dominates the rest. Sometimes this spiritual biological hierarchy is seen as racial in evolutionary spirituality. Not always, but occasionally. For example, in theosophy and anthroposophy and other more kind of fascist forms of German theosophy, certain races are seen as more spiritually evolved than others, and other races are seen as more animalistic or even demonic. This contempt for the unevolved masses in New Age culture can still be found in the psychedelic counterculture after World War II. So Abraham Maslow wrote, for example, only a small proportion of the human population gets to the point of identity or selfhood or full humanness or self-actualization. It is perfectly true that the mass of society is still like a dead weight. And you see it in psychedelic culture as well, this elitism. We are the elect and everyone else, they're the unturned on, square, ignorant masses. So this is Tom Wolfe writing in the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test about the merry pranksters. He writes, the world was simply and sheerly divided into the aware, those who had had the experience of being vessels of the divine, and a great mass of the unaware, the unmusical, the unattuned. Consciously, the aware were never snobbish towards the unaware, but in fact, most of that great jellyfish blob of straight souls looked like hopeless cases. You can see some of this kind of idea of a spiritual biological hierarchy in some of Timothy Leary's work, particularly the strange books that he wrote in the 1970s, like Intelligence Agents, for example. In that book, this is a graph from that book where he talks about a kind of genetic hierarchy between different cultures, with Africa and Asia at the bottom, and then eventually the kind of the Californian future humans, this new superior race, which he thought was emerging in California, which would eventually fly off and populate space. And Leary wrote, the folks of the old world inhabit pre-civilized barbarian gene pools. Europeans and Africans and Asians are our own animal origins, still obsessed with territorial conflict. The Africans are thus 2 million years behind California. By the by, Theosophy believed that the kind of new superior race of humans would evolve in California. So there's always been this idea of the future humans this kind of master race evolving in California. I don't know how familiar you are with Osho or Bhagwan Rajneesh, or how many of you saw the Netflix documentary about him, but you can really see in his kind of Nietzschean spirituality, this idea, this worship of the superhumans, including him and his followers, and this violent contempt for the ignorant masses, whether that's in America or anywhere else. So Osho said, his talks are full of comments like this. Scientifically, the average mental age of a human being is below 13. Those who are retarded will criticize you, condemn you. Ignore them. They are already stepping into their graves. Soon they will disappear. Now, the third of these four moral pitfalls is social Darwinism and Malthusianism. The idea that those at the bottom of the spiritual biological hierarchy should be allowed to die off for the good of, so that higher humans can evolve. In traditional Christianity, there's this idea that God loves the poor, the sick, the weak and wretched, and therefore we owe them charity. We should try to, help them and feed them and so forth. What happened in the 18th century from Malthus on, in this new kind of evolutionary spirituality, was this idea that in contrast, we should let the weak and sick die off so higher forms can emerge. There's this kind of progressive spiritual unfolding taking place. So if you charitably support the weak, the sick, and so on, you're just getting in the way of this natural evolutionary process. You see that in Herbert Spencer, for example. He wrote, "The whole effort of nature is to get rid of the unfit, to clear the world of them, to make room for better." Nietzsche likewise wrote, "Far too many live, and far too long they hang on their branches. Would that a storm came to shake all this rot and worm food from the tree." Osho is another extreme example of this kind of Malthusianism and social Darwinism. He wrote, "I want to be finished with the whole past completely. I want it to be erased completely. Only then the new humanity is possible, a new world, a new man. This world is not worth saving. It will be better if the Third World War happens and destroys this whole stupid humanity." So one can come across many examples of this idea of a kind of, there should be this natural culling or shedding of the lower forms. This is Barbara Marx Hubbard, who was one of the most influential champions of evolutionary spirituality in the 80s, 90s, and early noughties in California. And her writings often express this kind of idea. She wrote, "Individually, we can choose to embrace options for evolutionary choices, such as longevity, space migration, and evolved consciousness. Those who choose these paths will evolve differently from those who choose to remain in the terrestrial mammalian life cycle. Just as Neanderthal man passed away, so too will self-centered Homo sapiens retire once it has finished the work of preparing the way for Homo universalis. We will weed out the unworkable from the workable." And one still sees these attitudes a bit in modern transhumanism, the idea that there's going to be a bifurcation of humanity. Some will evolve and become cosmic immortal super beings, and some will not evolve, and they will, that's a kind of evolutionary dead end. So here's Christian Angermayer, who is, one of the leading investors in psychedelics. He set up Atai. He's the leading investor in Compass Pathways. And he has said in one interview, humanity could split up into two species, because you have a part of humanity who says, "Hey, bring it on, let's fly to Mars. If you want to go to Mars, you will need to change your bodies. We're going to have to modify." Everyone knows it. But there might be a part of humanity who says, "This is not for me. I don't want to merge with machines." So humanity might split into two species. So there's this idea of the sorting of the fit from the unfit, a natural selection of the fit from the unfit. And so the original kind of eugenic test would be war and reproductive fitness. Then it was the IQ test and the exam, now embryonic fitness tests. And I just wonder, sometimes one gets hints of that in psychedelic culture, this idea of psychedelics as a kind of evolutionary test of your fitness, which sorts the fit from the unfit. Can you pass the acid test? Can you take the heroic dose? And I think you also saw some aspects of this kind of spiritual Malthusianism during the pandemic, in the ableism of wellness culture and New Age culture. Here's Robert F. Kennedy, the kind of anti-vaxxer in chief. So just this idea that, you know, let nature take its course, let COVID take its course. The strong and the fit and the well and the able, they will naturally survive. And this is a kind of natural process which will clear off the weak and the infirm. Okay, the final moral pitfall that I'm going to talk about is spiritual eugenics. Now, the sense of a coming bifurcation between the elect and the passed over is not unique to evolutionary spirituality. But in Abrahamic religions, it is God who selects the wheat from the chaff, the sheep from the goats. In evolutionary spirituality, sometimes it is humans who select the fit from the unfit. It is the new priests of evolutionary spirituality, the scientist priests. As Nietzsche put it, the ruling caste of the future must now take the place of God. They deliver the physiologically botched by teaching them the doctrine of swift death. Now, not all proponents of evolutionary spirituality support eugenics. A few actively opposed it, like William James and Alfred Russel Wallace, for example. But many champions of evolutionary spirituality did support eugenics in some form. And of course, there are many varieties of eugenics. So, for example, Nietzsche, George Bernard Shaw, Ernst Haeckel, Julian and Aldous Huxley, H.G. Wells, Gerald Hurd, W.B. Yeats, Aleister Crowley, and several other members of the Golden Dawn, Rudolf Steiner and several other German theosophists, Jan Smuts, the father of holism, several members of the Society for Psychical Research, Sri Aurobindo, the Californian spiritual botanist Luther Burbank, John Harvey Kellogg, the kind of key figure in American wellness history, Alexis Carrel, the French Nobel Prize-winning scientist and spiritual guru, Teilhard de Chardin, all of them supported eugenic policies in some form or other. And even after World War II, even after the Nazis' eugenic atrocities, you still had people quietly supporting eugenic policies in evolutionary spirituality, like Abraham Maslow, never publicly, but in his private papers, he did say that there should be a kind of global regulation of reproduction. There should be a kind of body of scientists who choose who do and don't get to reproduce. Aldous Huxley likewise supported eugenic policies in his talks and writing right to the end of his life. Osho very explicitly said there should be a kind of global regulation of reproduction to ensure the evolution of super beings. The far-right white supremacist William Luther Pierce also put forward his own weird version of evolutionary spirituality, which was very much embraced eugenics. So let's talk a little bit about eugenics. It was called the religion of the future. And it's really a prime example of one of these evolutionary religions that emerged after the triumph of Darwinism in the 1880s. It was actually, the word eugenics was coined in, I think, 1883 by Francis Galton, Charles Darwin's cousin, the same year that Nietzsche published Thus Spake Zarathustra. So you have these two kind of visions of the future super being. So it was a new creed. I think this is often forgotten by people who study eugenics just as a kind of public health or a medical movement. It was also very much a religious movement. It was called a creed by Galton. He talked about a jihad for fitter humans. It was run by scientist priests aimed at producing superhumans, new Apollos and Dianas. This worship of the future super beings was combined with a homicidal contempt and loathing for those deemed unfit, who supposedly threatened the human race with extinction or descent into idiocy. There are many forms of eugenics. Positive eugenics, which is encouraging those deemed fit to breed more, and negative eugenics, which was trying to discourage those who were deemed unfit from breeding at all. There could be voluntary and involuntary forms of eugenics. There were less and more extreme forms of it. So it could be everything from health education to forcible sterilization or euthanasia. It was often racist and imperialist, but not always. There are many varieties of eugenics. Eugenic thinking was extremely popular from the 1870s to the 1940s and taken up by a whole host of movements. There were feminist eugenicists, socialist eugenicists, environmentalist eugenicists. It was big in the fitness and bodybuilding movement. There are even eugenicists you can find in the Harlem Renaissance or in the Mexican nationalism. There's a fascinating book called The Cosmic Race, La Raza Cosmica, by a Mexican author who thinks that Mexican mestizos are the kind of super race of the future. So there are many varieties of eugenic thinking. Now, often in this era, various activities like yoga, bodybuilding, psychedelics, or organic farming were promoted using eugenic rhetoric, that they would help the species to evolve into a kind of higher species. For example, in 1941, the German poet, soldier, physician Gottfried Benn called for a systematic educational effort in the direction of conscious enhancement of vitality. One could, by increasing visionary states, say with mescaline or hashish, supply the race with a stream of spiritual insights which could lead to a new creative period. So Ben there is calling for a state program of drugs to improve the vitality of the German race. Now, it's not really kind of typical eugenics. He's not talking there about controlling who does or doesn't reproduce. So I think sometimes when people are looking at the overlap of movements with eugenics, they can say, well, because some people were into both bodybuilding and eugenics, or both organic farming and eugenics, therefore, bodybuilding is eugenic or organic farming is eugenic. That's not what I'm saying. Using eugenic rhetoric does not mean a particular movement essentially is eugenic. However, often those who use eugenic rhetoric do also actively support eugenic policies, as Gottfried Benn did. Several other important figures in psychedelic history supported authoritarian eugenic policies, and I think that's interesting and worthy of kind of comment and study, like Havelock Ellis, who did the first British psychedelic experiments in 1898 or so. Likewise, W.B. Yeats, one of his participants, or Yeats's colleague in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, Aleister Crowley, H.G. Wells and Julian Huxley, these early transhumanists who talked about using chemicals and drugs as a means to kind of help evolution advance and help the evolution of super beings. And they also very much promoted eugenics as a means to help the evolution of super beings. Eugenics had a completely central role in Julian Huxley's neo-religion of evolutionary humanism. When he became the first Director General of UNESCO, he immediately published a manifesto saying we should make evolutionary humanism the new kind of religion of UNESCO, and eugenics should be at the heart of that. I mean, that's so startled people that was the reason that Julian Huxley was only a one-term Director General of UNESCO. His brother Aldous Huxley likewise as I've said, supported eugenic policies. He supported involuntary sterilization before World War II. After World War II, he still supported positive eugenics, this idea that we should use techniques like freezing the sperm of geniuses and then using it to create superior babies. I mean, that appears in his last novel, Island, where a certain proportion of the population of Ireland are created through genius sperm banks. And in fact, one of Julian Huxley's students helped to create a genius sperm bank, which existed in California for a few years, and people could go to this genius, it was in Montecito, and people could go to this genius sperm bank and select. The idea was the sperm of Nobel Prize winners, but I'm not sure they got any to actually contribute their sperm, and thereby ensure that their children were superior children. And in fact, Rupert Sheldrake, who was a friend of Julian Huxley's nephew, his son, Francis Huxley, told me that Francis Huxley often received letters from people claiming to be the descendants of Julian Huxley from sperm banks. I don't know if he really did donate his sperm to these sperm banks. Anyway, this is a bit of a digression. Abraham Maslow also supported eugenic policies privately. He also thought that there should be global regulation of who does and doesn't reproduce, as did Osho. And so I think there's this illiberal authoritarian tendency, which one can find in evolutionary spirituality. The idea that we must upgrade humanity, we must enable the evolution of super beings, even if the unevolved masses resist. There can be the promotion of illiberal medical spiritual utopias. And I'm fascinated by the parallels I see between Aldous Huxley's Brave New World from 1931, this obviously authoritarian static society managed by scientists, in which reproduction is completely managed. But I see similarities between that and his utopia, his hippie utopia of Ireland, which is also a completely static society managed by scientist priests. And it's also a eugenic society. So just finally, one still does find examples of eugenics from the 70s on, but it tends to be liberal eugenics. With the evolution, with the development of technologies of genetic modification, eugenics became more sophisticated. It was less about governments controlling who can and can't reproduce and sterilizing those deemed unfit. And instead, there were these new genetic technologies which supposedly could upgrade both embryos and even kind of already born people. So these were very much embraced by certain kind of Californian visionaries like Timothy Leary from the 1970s on. And Leary, in his writings of the 70s, says what various transhumanists have said since the 1970s, and various extropians and so on. Leary said, let us upgrade our minds, our bodies, and our genes with these new technologies like psychedelics or stem cell research or genetic modification. And if you don't let us do that, we'll go offshore or off-world and create our own libertarian utopias of superhumans. So when he was in Folsom Prison, Timothy Leary wrote this extraordinary book called Terror 2. He claimed to be channeling messages from aliens. And the aliens, of course, with Leary, one can never tell to what extent this is a joke or not. But he claimed that he had a mission to attract 5,000 superior human beings who would man a space shuttle that would go into space and seed a new higher species. He got very into this idea that humans could evolve into smarter, more intelligent, quasi-immortal species. and that he and others could be the kind of the seeds of this new species. So this is one of the illustrations from Terra 2. It says the crew of Terra 2 selects itself the way the genetic code builds up a chain of elements. So there's a whole passage here about a selection of the fittest, most beautiful, and so on for this crew. This reminds me very much of Moonraker, if any of you have seen that Bond film. So psychedelics and liberal eugenics today, many of the leading biotech investors in psychedelics today also invest in genetic modification technology aimed at creating a superior, longer living, smarter species. People like Peter Thiel, Christian Angermeyer, Steve Jurvetson, and Elon Musk. Now, there's clearly a moral difference between liberal eugenics, where people are choosing to use genetic modification technologies, and authoritarian eugenics, where reproductive policies are imposed on people involuntarily. However, perhaps new moral issues emerge from this new liberal eugenics, like, for example, safety, but also democratic access to new medical technologies. Is this just what Douglas Rushkoff calls survival of the richest, that only the extremely wealthy get access to these new technologies, that they kind of retreat from the collapse of modern societies to their psychedelic genetic ashrams, to their gated spiritual communities, and to try and turn themselves into the super beings who will emerge from their gated communities to repopulate the world after the kind of climate apocalypse. So in conclusion, I hope you agree with me at least that evolutionary spirituality is a significant and under-researched cultural frame for New Age spirituality and for psychedelics in Western culture. I'm sure some of you will disagree with some aspects of this rather broad picture that I've painted, but nonetheless, I think you'll agree at the very least that this is a very interesting and influential frame for Western spirituality and for psychedelic culture. It has deep historical roots and is still very active today in various forms, particularly in Silicon Valley transhumanism. And I hope you also agree that it has some moral pitfalls. Spiritual narcissism, contempt for the less evolved masses, social Darwinism and Malthusianism, this idea of letting the weak die off, a tendency to spiritual eugenics and to illiberal medical spiritual utopias. Once again, I do not say that everyone who believes in evolutionary spirituality inevitably falls into this moral pitfalls, only that one often sees people doing so. Could there be a less elitist, less authoritarian, more democratic, and more pluralist form of evolutionary spirituality? Yes, for example, William James, in some ways, he believed in a kind of evolutionary form of spirituality, but it was pluralist. It didn't believe that evolution evolves up one ladder, one escalator, in one inevitable direction, but instead in multiple different directions, and that we should encourage what John Stuart Mill called experiments in living, eccentric, different kind of experiments, because it may develop new potentialities, new kind of capacities. William James's version of evolutionary spirituality is very humane. He didn't see himself as one of the elect. He knew he had his own kind of psychological foibles. He was anti-eugenic. He wrote, he reminds me of Thomas Huxley, who was Aldous and Julian Huxley's grandfather, the great biologist. He was also an anti-eugenicist. And Thomas Huxley said, don't we, I'm paraphrasing from memory, but don't we all of us have days when we could classify as one of the unfit? I mean, Thomas Huxley was prone to, like William James, depressive episodes. So both of them knew that they could classify as the unfit. They could find themselves, forcibly sterilized under the wrong conditions. And I feel that with people like Julian and Aldous Huxley as well, both of whom were actually prone to this inherited psychological instability. And, Julian Huxley suffered from bipolar disorder. And I see many of the kind of champions of eugenic evolutionary spirituality, I think they were maybe sometimes projecting their own insecurities and instabilities onto the population, saying it's those people out there who are unfit. Anyway, how finally does all of this relate to our main research, which is on challenging psychedelic experiences, what I've been working on for the, with Irini and many others for the last few years? Well, I mean, I became interested in the topic of challenging psychedelic experiences when I had a bad trip when I was 18, as a result of which I developed post-traumatic stress disorder, social anxiety, and I really felt like a kind of psychological basket case for several years. And it was right at a time where I was very into figures like Nietzsche and D.H. Lawrence, and reading people like Lawrence and Nietzsche. I mean, they tended to say, if you're kind of damaged, then that's it, you're a dead end. You should probably just kill yourself. So that was, I kind of rejected that way of thinking. I was looking for something more compassionate, which could help me accept myself, accept my wounds, and to heal. I had this feeling also very much of having kind of failed the acid test, that I had all these wonderful psychedelic experiences, but now I had the bad experience and I'd kind of damaged myself. I was a kind of failure. And I think sometimes, people who have bad trips, which lead them feeling damaged, can feel tremendous kind of shame and guilt and so on after these kinds of bad experiences. And I think this evolutionary ethos can still pervade psychedelic culture. Are you a member of the evolutionary elect? Are you one of these future superhumans, or are you genetically unstable and inferior? Like William James, I have compassion for the misfits because I identify with them more than with the evolutionary elect. And that's why I point out the elitist and illiberal tendencies in evolutionary spirituality and New Age culture more generally. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jules. I think that was some very interesting food for thought for everyone. Are there any questions to start in the room here? Yes, Steve?
Jules, thanks a lot for that. I take my hat off to your contrarian powers for choosing that particular target and eviscerating it so comprehensively. I think I've got a couple of questions, actually. One is more about the Challenging Experiences project. The first one is more about spiritual narcissism, etc. I feel like I'm kind of shouting up to you over there, but of course I'm not. The drug itself and the characteristics of the, well, I say drug, psychedelics, let's think LSD, psilocybin. Has that contributed to this culture? If you think that rave culture has an element of ecstasy flowing through it, and other subcultures are also said to have been influenced by their favorite drugs.
So is the question whether the drugs themselves might have contributed to some of these kind of characteristics?
I'm thinking, for example, ego inflation could be attributed.
Yeah.
And also, that sense, certainly when I was younger and we were all taking acid, it was very, it's just us and no one else must know what we're doing because then we'll be in trouble. And that kind of contributes to a sort of tribalism, mini tribalism, I think.
I agree. I think that psychedelics can often lead to this sense of we are the special ones, we are the initiated, we are the elect. And that can take, so I agree with that. And that can take different forms. I think it's possible to think that without believing in evolutionary spirituality particularly. So I've just been researching this Bufo cult in Mexico. And, it's an extraordinary story. This Miami real estate agent smoked 5-MeO DMT, started a retreat center in Mexico, became, smoked so much of it every day that he became convinced he was Jesus, and his followers. He would smoke 5-MeO-DMT, give it to his followers in this retreat center, and then go up and shout in their face, "Who am I?" And they had to say, "You're Jesus." Anyway, so that's an example of kind of clearly ego inflation and cultishness, which didn't involve evolutionary spirituality. But I think, evolution, that kind of spiritual narcissism goes quite well with evolutionary spirituality as well. Anyway, to answer your question briefly, yes, I think that there are some aspects of the drug which do seem to lead to ego inflation and therefore kind of contribute to this kind of narcissism.
And I was on the call the other day about the Experiences Project, which was great. And you briefly mentioned there about feedback you were getting from the reports about experiences that weren't bad trips as such. They were just sort of not very exciting or interesting or enchanting or magical. And I've had bad trips myself, but I've certainly had more of those. And what are we going to call them?
What was it? There's mystical experiences and there's meh experiences, like MEH. That's why I sometimes call them like meh. Nothing very much.
I just wondered if you could talk a bit more about, and maybe Irene could as well, about those, what you're getting back about those particular reports, the mere trips.
Well, yeah, sure. I'll hand over to Irene, but I mean, in brief, they don't show up so much in our survey because we kind of particularly were asking about extended difficulties. But people sometimes, certainly one of the categories in our survey that we did in our thematic analysis of all these 600 responses was feelings of disappointment, particularly if people tried psychedelics for mental health and they feel like they're in the last chance saloon and they've tried everything else, and then they try psychedelics either in trials or in the underground and it doesn't work, and they feel even worse. So we did come across that. Irene, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think this is what I would think in relation to these experiences as well, that people can see negative effects afterwards because of all these expectations that the hype creates. So in that sense, the link perhaps with people that talk about they have passed this acid test, they've had these challenging experiences and they're like this new version now. It's a matter of comparison. But yeah, I wouldn't say that these are the cases that we see that come with the most difficulty.
Thanks, guys.
Any more questions? Yes?
Yeah, I find that talk really interesting. I realize you were talking about the critical aspects of evolutionary spirituality, but I just wanted to ask you about how evolution is conceived in these contexts. So evolution is usually about a species and an environment and fitting together. What can we say about the environment of spiritual evolution? I mean, you've concentrated on wolf or eugenic breeding programs, but when I've tried to look into this superficially in the past, I had the feeling that that wasn't what was steering the evolutionary process. So, for example, Aldous Huxley at some point mentions universal mind. So the evolution is kind of tuning into something like that. Does that make any sense to you? Is that the way?
Yes, you're right. I mean, Darwinian evolution would be the idea of fitness to certain circumstances, to certain conditions. Spiritual evolution, it's more about, it's kind of a global evolution, the evolution of the human species. I suppose you could say, both that it's connected. I think they sometimes see it connected to certain historical conditions, like things like the evolution of a global society. So you say, taking Teilhard de Chardin, there's a sense of the evolution of the new sphere is connected to new technologies as well, to the kind of, or to the emergence of the internet, they're often supporters of evolutionary spirituality. Not always, but quite often they are globalists, people like H.G. Wells and Julian Huxley and Aldous Huxley. They think there's going to be the evolution of a global society beyond national differences. And then eventually that will be, you know, that we will start evolving into space. We will become these cosmic beings, and this is the next step. So in that sense, there is that the sense that spiritual evolution is connected to kind of environmental conditions, and particularly to technological conditions. But then, you know, there's so many varieties of it. So this is one of the challenges. Like, there are kind of racist proponents of evolutionary spirituality, like particularly, you know, Germans and Nazis, who would say, well, you know, Northern Europeans have evolved to be the master race because of particular conditions, because of the cold and so on. Or this Jose Vasconcelos, he was the Mexican Minister of Education, who wrote this extraordinary book, La Raza Cósmica, the cosmic race, and he thought that Mexicans were the superior, you know, master race because in Latin America you have the throwing together of all these different races, and that leads to kind of that interbreeding of races leads to kind of superior humans. A similar idea is put forward about like why the future human would evolve in California, because America is this breeding pot, and the fittest humans move to America, and therefore you've got this kind of, you know, genetic selection of the fittest, and that's why, you know, the superior beings end up in California, and especially in Silicon Valley. So, you know, I don't know if that's answering your question, but that's just some of the ways that environmental conditions can feed in people's theories with this evolution of the kind of future human.
I mean, that's a very kind of modern materialist version of the environment in which evolution is happening. I just had the impression, yeah, from looking at people like Huxley or even Michael Murphy, that there was something more spacey going on, that this kind of evolution was latching onto something which wasn't, you know.
Oh yes, that's clearly true. Like there's often this idea of not just evolution but involution. So there's not just the evolution of material forms to higher levels, but there's an involution of spirit, from the divine, from mind at large, from the kind of, you know, supermind, and so on, or from, you know, there's all kinds of again varieties of it. But yes, absolutely, this is spiritual. Theories of evolutionary spirituality are spiritual. They believe also in some kind, often in some kind of transcendent, you know, God guiding this evolutionary process and interacting with it.
Yeah, and yeah, this question also made me think about the connection with nature itself, and how, like, this evolution, what role are we saying humans play in relation to the rest of nature? But perhaps if this relates, we have a question online from Oliver. So this talk, Oliver says, mostly focused on the issues stemming from worshipping a super individual, drawing from a Western individualist tradition. I'm wondering if Jules has any knowledge about whether there are equivalents of this in more collectivist cultures or terms.
That's very interesting. In some ways, you can see it. Again, this is the varieties of evolutionary spirituality. You can see it as leading to a kind of individualism, a worship of the Übermensch, the rugged individual who exists separate from mass man, who doesn't need the welfare state, who doesn't need any state at all. You know, Nietzsche said something like, there where the state ends, the higher being emerges. So, but you can, you know, you can also see it from another direction as extremely collectivist. So sometimes, you know, champions of evolutionary spirituality were very ecological in their thinking. They thought we need to see the human species as a whole, and think about, you know, how to guide the human species to higher forms. So, you know, people like Julian Huxley and H.G. Wells and Ernst Haeckel, these were the champions of ecological thinking in the the 1880s to the 1930s, because they thought, because they argued we need to see humans as a species, and we need to manage the species much as we like manage livestock, much as we like manage natural resources. They argued we need to manage the human species by encouraging the fittest to reproduce more, and by discouraging the least fit, in inverted commas, to reproduce at all. So yes, in some ways you can see this can be taken in highly individualist forms, libertarian forms. I don't owe anything to other people. I reject the state. Just leave me and my friends alone to develop our libertarian utopia. Or it could be developed in highly collectivist forms, where individual rights have to be disregarded for the good of the species.
Thank you. Chris, you have a question?
Yeah, I thought I'd comment before my question that the focus on California as a weird transhumanist thing, that there's a British equivalent called Anglo-futurism, which is pretty entertaining, and that there's a lot of good memes about it online. Anglo-futurism.
I haven't heard. Thanks.
Yeah, it did the rounds on Twitter like 3 months ago. It's bad. My question was, your presentation talked a lot about elitism, and the idea of like the elect, the past, like some people can make it through the various stages or not. I'm curious where you draw the line between it being elitism and it being kind of a ritualistic rite of passage kind of thing. Because across the world, there are various groups who use varying degrees of substance as a kind of becoming a man from a child, as it were.
Yeah.
Where does the line sit between those?
I think that's a really good question. And it's one of the responses I've got most, in the limited responses I've got to this paper, is people saying, well, is the idea of an elect or an elite or in a hierarchy always wrong or bad? I gave a talk on this at Esalen, in fact. I was invited there for a seminar on the superhuman organized by Jeffrey Kripal at Rice University. And Jeff, his response was, firstly, religions have always been eugenic. They've always been concerned with breeding. When you think about it, it is an interesting way to look at the history of religion. But secondly, there's always been this idea of the elect and of higher and lower. And I get that point. Like, you take part in a spiritual practice or a spiritual tradition to try and improve in a certain way. You go to a meditation teacher because you think they have something to teach you. You undergo a ritual or initiation or a retreat or these kinds of things to try to develop, to advance. The Buddha said, I am awake. Now here's a path to become like me. So of course there is this in most religions, this idea that you can become higher and better. So I think that, like I said, you can find that in most religious traditions. But I think it's important to build in certain kind of features to make sure that doesn't develop into kind of excessively elitist narcissism. And I've argued that one of the ways that evolutionary spirituality can lead to kind of rather rigid elitism and narcissism is this idea that we are not just better because we practice this meditation. We are essentially better. We are biologically superior as well as spiritually. And the other thing is, I think a mature spiritual tradition builds in things like humility, and the sense of like not glorifying in your superiority, but kind of reminding yourself that we're all flawed as well. I think that's one of the things I respect about Christianity, this sense that we all mess up, we all fuck up, and that's just being human. So I accept the point that that several people have made to me in response to this paper, which is, yes, some kind of idea of better or worse is an inevitable part of all spiritual traditions. But I think a wise and mature spiritual tradition builds in certain checks against this tendency to arrogance and a kind of rigid, cased elitism.
Thanks.
Thank you. We do also have an interesting comment from Bolin. So because reincarnation and animism are the core concepts in our traditions, time evolution as a process can be taken off from the equation. Still, each life we have is a gift, hence a grand expression we should honor. So in that sense, we're evolving in this timeline individually or in the community we're connected with. Thank you, Bolin. If you wanted to say anything further as well, or what is the tradition that you're coming from? Here, or I think, Peter, you had your hand up earlier. I don't know if that was a comment or question.
No, I was just going to read out Oliver's question online. So, but I do have a question anyway. I suppose I'm more a fan of Bergson, this book you mentioned, than you are, obviously, and Nietzsche for that matter, and others. But anyway, I suppose, like Bergson's critique of evolution was that he wasn't a teleologist, but he was halfway there, as it were. And it seems to me that part of this critique is, and I've really enjoyed the paper, by the way, and the presentation now, but part of this critique is based on a form of our current understanding of evolution. And I think that our current understanding of evolution is, I mean, it's, I don't think it's wrong, but I think there's more to add to it. For example, in the philosophy of mind, mental causation is a big problem under a certain paradigm, scientific paradigm. And there's a lot of arguments to say that mental causation should be integrated with the theory of evolution. Mental causation relates to teleology, the idea that there are purposes within nature. And like within a human being, there is a purpose, for example, to procreate for the species and so on. And Bergson's criticism of Darwinism, the Darwinist theory of evolution, really was that it completely excludes teleology now. And I think that's still an open question. I know teleology is not particularly fashionable at the moment, but I think it's an open question because it relates to mental causation. And so I suppose my point is this, that if we do accept a form of teleology in nature, then that would actually have ramifications on understanding a kind of, a processual view of nature, that it's not just static and there's no hierarchy, but actually there is some kind of ideal to which we progress. I suppose this is kind of Hegelianism to a certain extent. Nietzsche said, controversially, as always, without Hegel, there would be no Darwin. Mm-hmm. And second question really is, I wonder, and it's something I'm looking into now, like to what extent is Hegel really influential in our understandings of mysticism? Because, cosmic consciousness from Edward Carpenter, people think comes from India, which does partly Edward Carpenter's time there, but also, I mean, that was the time of British idealism or British Hegelianism, where eternal consciousness was a common phrase used from Hegel. So anyway, my question is this, are you open to the possibility that the theory of evolution is not yet complete and that this might have ramifications on the critique of transhumanism, especially?
Yeah, I mean, I am certainly open to the idea that certain aspects of evolutionary spirituality could be scientifically valid. So I'm not really, my paper is not engaging with its scientific validity. I don't get into that. Like, could be. I'm interested in the possibility. I agree with you that that kind of there can be narrow forms of Darwinism which don't leave any place for consciousness and for choice. I also think that it's possible. I'm making moral critiques. First of all, I'm saying, look, let's consider these traditions. They're important. So that's my first argument. Like, they've been under-researched, under-commented on. These are influential to New Age culture and to psychedelic culture. And I think we both agree on that. Yeah. And, then secondly, I say, however, that it's a moral argument, really. Yeah, after the kind of just like, this is a historical thing and we should kind of, it's like, it can lead to these kinds of moral issues.
Mhm.
But I don't say that always essentially does.
Mhm.
And there are many exceptions, like, like James's kind of pluralist evolutionary spirituality. There are these different kind of potentialities which can evolve. And you see that, on Julian Huxley as well. He talks about, he was very into Bergson. And he talks about, we develop different potentialities through play, through experiment, which with Bergson, there's that idea as well, isn't there? These kind of nature playing and evolving into these different forms, and it not being a kind of rigid escalator. It's more of a kind of emerging experiment. So that would be the kind of, that more pluralist model of evolutionary spirituality I would like more than a kind of this rigid hierarchy, and I'm definitely at the top of it.
Yeah, sure.
So, and again, I don't think Bergson, he didn't, in my I won't know him as well as you do, but he certainly wasn't, he didn't promote eugenics at a time when lots of other people, because he was in the psychical research scene, and a lot of people who supported psychical research did support eugenics. Bergson didn't. He seems kind of a humane person, not an elitist, not a snob. So so as far as you were saying about kind of Hegel and mysticism, I mean, it's fascinating. I haven't read Hegel. I put it off, because out of fear. But yes, I think he's clearly important in this tradition, in this idea of a kind of a historical evolution of spirit, and of Geist. So
no. So I think there's you've opened up a whole can of worms there for historical research and scientific and metaphysical research as well. So thanks a lot.
Well, I just say, finally, Peter, that because I was thinking of you a bit, because I know we're both fans of Nietzsche, and this paper and this work, it does rather slam Nietzsche for his homicidal eugenic tendencies, which I think are there. And I think, but I also grew up loving Nietzsche, and I do really, he's as a philosopher, he's almost incomparable in terms of as a stylist. So I have this kind of real love-hate relationship with Nietzsche. I'm obsessed with his theory of the Dionysian, Apollinian, but I do think there is this dark side to him, and I think that we have to confront it.
For sure. He has, you did pick the worst parts of him, but there's another side to him as well, and don't forget, of course, he also was influential on the left as well as the right, in terms of power structures, understanding power structures, and so on. But that's another talk. Anyway, thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you. And we do have a few more questions in the chat. So Rebecca is asking, what about the unwell, the unfit, those with adverse reactions to both psychedelics and prescription drugs? What about those with both positive and negative experiences with drugs and spiritual emergencies in this context? Are we not in need of readdressing how the unwell and therefore the unfit might contribute valuable insights into how we progress as human beings?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the serious issues with eugenics in the 20s was how it just labeled people. Labeled people as essentially kind of unfit, disregarding the fact that we're all a mixture of the kind of the well and the unwell. And on a certain stage in our life, we might be very unwell, and then we could be later well again. And even the very unwell in some ways will often have tremendous gifts and capacities. So that kind of sorting of humans into the kind of viable and the non-viable and the fit and the unfit is one of the most horrible aspects of this science religion. And unfortunately, I think it did feed into psychiatry, and certain kind of pioneering psychiatrists like Asperger, for example, were also eugenicists. So you can have this idea that certain people are just essentially basket cases that in the old idea of psychosis. You've had a psychotic episode. They could include a temporary psychotic episode after psychedelics. So I'm afraid you're just, you know, you're genetically inferior. You're a basket case. You know, and you have nothing interesting to tell us, and your experience has nothing interesting or meaningful to tell us. I think thankfully we're now seeing that that's a very cruel and outdated theory, and that, you know, people can have psychosis-like experiences and still lead normal functional lives, and that, you know, that sometimes these experiences, like psychedelic experiences, can be meaningful and interesting. I mean, they can also be devastating but I just think it's interesting. We are still very much a eugenic culture in all kinds of ways. And I think it's interesting to kind of consider it. I think all of us really are influenced by eugenic thinking. This is not something that happened in the 1920s. You know, it completely infuses our cultures in all kinds of ways, but including in harmful ways. And I think we can still see its influence in psychiatry.
Can I say something? Sorry. I'm just working my way through your Breaking Open book, Jules, and reading lots of people's spiritual emergencies, and that's why I said something about health and the unwell in relation to what you're talking about today, which is really worrying me, since it's just uncovered a number of my key philosophers and psychologists and writers as people who potentially supported eugenics, which I find quite terrifying at the minute for my PhD. So I'm a bit scared from what you've just told us today. But I think there's there's loads of really amazing points that you've raised today. I'm also trying to connect that to some of the other research that I've been listening to from you and from Peter as well. I think, can I just say, I think if we've discovered that Bergson wasn't a eugenicist, but Aldous Huxley was, can I just go back to Peter on that as well? Because I'm quite frightened by some of this research, I have to say, Jules. I find it quite frightening that there's many figures who are in support of eugenics, and that kind of split people off into camps of those who could progress and those who couldn't, hence the unfit. That is worrying me quite a lot at the minute.
Well, yeah, it was, if when you research eugenics, it was hugely popular. It was hugely popular. It was, you know, if you were an intellectual in like 1890 to 1910, you were more likely to support eugenics than to be against it. I mean, it was an example of this kind of medical fashion, which was so popular. It's very rare to find people who stood up and spoke against it, like William James, like Thomas Huxley, like G.K. Chesterton. Most people agree with it in some form. They might not have believed in involuntary sterilization. They might have believed, you know, just in kind of health education, you know, how to pick a fit partner, that kind of thing. And we still do that, right? We still think, is this partner, you know, how appropriate are they going to be? Are they unstable? What would our kids be like? You know, everyone does most people do genetic testing of their fetuses, of their embryos. Most people, now there's this technology called you know, embryo selection, where people who do IVF, they get given, like, you know, they do genetic analysis of all the embryos, and you can now have the technology to choose an embryo less likely to get depression when they're older. I think most people would, if given the option, choose, if they were, you know, said, okay, here are 10 possible embryos, and these ones are the least likelihood of depression. Many would choose that, and that's a form of kind of liberal eugenics. It's based on kind of, you know, personal choice of the parents. So, but yes, you know, you know, it has some extremely dark chapters, this history, extremely dark. But, you know, because a person supported eugenics does not mean, you know, like, does not mean that every aspect of their theories is tainted with the kind of, you know, the sin of eugenics. So, and that we can't possibly enjoy the writings of Aldous Huxley anymore. It's just, you know, this, we have to try and study history somewhat dispassionately as well as the evolution of these ideas and trends, and you know, often in ways that we will historically reject decades later. So, and we have to try and be careful in our study of it as well, and remember that there were many different varieties of it, all kinds. So I often see it's such a hot topic now, eugenics, that people say, oh, it's always white supremacist, but it wasn't always white supremacist. You know, there were all kinds of it. There were people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who is the kind of, you know, famous African-American scholar. He also supported eugenics. So did feminists, so did environmentalists. So it's literally, you know, it's a whole chapter in Western intellectual history, not just Western either, also in India and in China and in Russia and in Singapore, because we're all trying to grapple with how to make sense of evolutionary theory and how to incorporate it into our culture. And we haven't figured that out entirely yet, particularly as new genetic technologies emerge. So that's where we are.
Thank you. Thank you, Jules.
Yeah, I think definitely worth emphasizing that there is a world of nuance behind calling someone a eugenics supporter or evolutionary spirituality supporter. And I think, yeah, but we do have two questions that are kind of related between them and to this. So firstly, we have a comment from Camila. Thank you, Jules. Some of the points you make reminded me of some discourses on ayahuasca and ancestral inherited trauma, which are perceived as stored in genes and fixable through purge and cleansing. Do you think this can be related to psychedelic eugenics and evolutionary spirituality? And then if you also wanted to respond to whether, because in your talk you didn't connect this to psychedelics evangelism, as Oliver says, he's wondering if or what sort of connection you see in this, in the current trends.
What current trends? Psychedelic evangelism?
Yeah, whether you see psychedelic evangelism, from what I understand in this question, as a connection to this evolutionary spirituality, and then the discourse on storage in genes, fixable through purging and cleansing, that is also popular within this psychedelic renaissance.
Yeah, well, I mean, some of these ideas definitely play out in psychedelic culture, but in weird, interesting ways. I haven't met many people in the modern psychedelic culture who believe in old school 20s style eugenics. Very few do, you know, believe that there should be a kind of some kind of political system that rules who can and can't reproduce. I mean, I've come across it occasionally, but very rarely. But you do see all kind, you know, ideas of certain practices will speed up your evolution in some ways, or possibly speed up the evolution of humanity. But you know, like you get this idea of DNA activation in some, you know, you might come across an Instagram spirituality that through certain practices or certain drugs or rituals, you will activate your DNA and evolve to the 5th dimension, for example. Or through certain processes, you can heal your ancestral trauma and evolve to be a super being. There's also, I mean, one chapter in this kind of draft book that I've been writing about looks at UFO culture, which is a whole story that intersects with evolutionary spirituality and with eugenic thinking. This idea that, you know, that aliens are controlling some kind of cosmic eugenic program to evolve superior beings, and that some humans are actually not really humans, they're star seeds, they're a different species, they're part of this cosmic eugenic program. whilst other humans are kind of inferior and unfit. They're like a lower species. So what you saw in UFO culture in the 1950s onwards was some of these ideas of spiritual eugenics and spiritual evolution feeding into UFO culture. Anyway, I wrote an essay online all about star seeds and how it involves some of these eugenic and racial ideas. So that's another area you see some of these ideas play out. As for psychedelic evangelism, yes, I think sometimes, with people say, for example, like Rick Doblin or Roland Griffiths, there is this sense that psychedelics will play a critical role in the evolution of humans, and that this is, like what H.G. Wells called a race between education and catastrophe. Like either humans will evolve to a higher level or they're going to go extinct. And if you saw Roland Griffiths talk at Psychedelic Science, that's what he says. He says we're facing these existential threats, and so evolution could be psychedelics could be very important in the survival of humanity and the evolution of humanity. Now, because the stakes are seen as so high, because this is a race between extinction or evolution, that can lead to this psychedelic evangelism. Like if the stakes are so high, then this must happen. And what that can mean is we must therefore not talk too much about the risks of psychedelics, not talk too much about the harms of psychedelics. If a pilot takes mushrooms and then 48 hours later experiences such extreme derealization that they think they're in a dream and try to crash the plane they're in, as happened last week, that must be dismissed as their psychological instabilities, nothing to do with the mushrooms. So I'm writing a piece just now for my newsletter. It's called The Cost of Utopia. If you have such high utopian expectations for psychedelics, then certain costs are acceptable in terms of psychedelic harms. So I think that's how this kind of thinking can lead into a kind of evangelism and a utopianism.
Thank you, Jules. Are there any last questions or comments from the room? Yes, Steve?
Is evolutionary spirituality not a sort of non sequitur? I mean, we all kind of fail to spiritually evolve as humans throughout lifetime. And then spiritual terms are born again and have to learn new lessons. What I'm getting at is we refer to sort of 5,000, 10,000-year-old texts for our spirituality. Does it evolve? Can it evolve at all?
Well, I mean, that's a perfectly legitimate question. That do humans morally advance? Does the species morally advance? Is that even kind of possible? And
you won't have the answer, mate. But
no, but I mean, on certain days, I think not, and on other days, I think maybe so.
Does it show how bogus the whole thing is?
Well, there have been people who've said that. There have been biologists who've criticized, evolutionary moral theories, starting from Thomas Huxley. Thomas Huxley wrote a great essay called Evolution and Ethics in about 1880. And he said, look, evolution is not a moral process. If you're in a really vicious environment, then the fittest specimen is going to be the most vicious. So he warned about trying to kind of harness our ethics or our religion onto evolutionary theory. He said, don't do it. It's dangerous, particularly because it can often lead to, this kind of eugenic thinking. So yeah, but I think you could possibly make a kind of defense of some forms of evolutionary spirituality, like possibly, you could argue that some kind of moral progress is evident in human history, that we we do, you know, and people like Steven Pinker have argued that, and H.G. Wells. So on my more positive and optimistic days, I think maybe we are evolving both technologically and morally, and maybe this, you know, this is a species-wide thing, and maybe we do have a glorious destiny ahead of us to kind of explore through space. So it depends on my mood, really, which attitude I kind of feel on any given day.
Thanks. See you on the Ark.
God.
And a last question. So I'm wondering if we do see evolutionary spirituality, or rather linking it back to Steve's original question of the link to ego inflation, as a useful way for people to cope with the dissolution of their previous sense of self. And if they feel transformed, they can use that as a crutch to make sure that they don't go back to a previous way of looking at the world. So evolutionary spirituality seems to provide a broader framework to fit that new identity. So since they've evolved, they can't go back. Do you see a potential there for this to be healthy, or if people are feeling subjectively more mentally healthy, is there a way to then support or encourage a way of that framing to be linked to nature, a purpose that is interconnected with a wider whole, rather than that they are specifically more evolved than others?
Yes, I think it is possible. And the example I would give is in our research, as we saw, quite a few people talk about having kind of difficulties after trips, having extended psychospiritual crises, wondering what's going on, being given strictly kind of biological frames for it, like, oh, you've just messed up your neural chemistry, and that's that. And people talk about being helped by finding the frame of spiritual emergency. Not everyone is, but quite a few people in our research say that, don't they? That they came across the work of Stan Grof or others, and this idea of spiritual emergency was helpful to them in terms of reframing their crisis as possibly a kind of growth experience. And if you look at the theory of spiritual emergency, as defined by the Grofs, it is somewhat connected to evolutionary spirituality. So the Grofs define spiritual emergency as a kind of temporary, turbulent stage in the individual's evolution to a higher state. Now, I think there are problems, you know, which we don't have time to go into, but with Grof's theory of spiritual emergency. One problem, very briefly, is that I think the Grofs tried to kind of separate ordinary bog standard, you know, psychological problems and psychosis from these special cases of spiritual emergency, which happens to kind of special people at places like Esalen, rather than seeing this as a continuum, actually, and that, you know, an awful lot of psychotic experiences have spiritual aspects to them. So that's one issue. It's the attempt to kind of bracket off spiritual emergencies from other kinds of psychological crises. The second issue is that Grof sees this as a species-wide evolutionary process. So in certain organizations like the Spiritual Crisis Network, there's a teleology here, which is that more and more spiritual emergencies are happening because humans are waking up. We are waking up to a higher level of consciousness. To which I say kind of, well, maybe, but maybe not. Who knows for sure? Like, you know, that teleology isn't really necessary. Like, let's just support people through these crises without having to try and, you know, hoist them onto some grand cosmic teleological vision of humanity waking up, which actually could, you know, I'm not sure that's necessarily helpful to people. So, you know, just briefly, yes, Irini, I think that we've definitely seen in our research that the frame of spiritual emergency is often helpful to people in psychospiritual crises. However, I can see some kind of problematic issues with some kind of ways that one could interpret spiritual emergency. Does that make sense? It's a bit of a a brief answer to
Good.
the
For
question.
sure, I think it is about moving away more from comparative views of the more evolved than you to seeing how can, if we do find coping that is useful through framings of evolution of I've gone through that challenge and I'm now a step further, that is not a matter of comparison, but more pluralist framings, as you mentioned, James, might be more worth tapping into in the future. Thank you so much, Jules. I realize we are quite over the time, but I think everyone really appreciated this talk and discussion.